The PokerGO studio where Heads Up Play
Hello,
is set to
everyone.
begin.
I thought it would be
Courtesy
fun
of
to take the
violence
opportunity after
came at the
this
expense
glorious
of
victory
Arthur Peacock, who's
to
out in third.
go ahead and yeah, just do some commentary of my own thoughts over the top of this Heads Up match against needless to say, one of the best players of all time, our generation certainly, in Sam Soverel, and clarify some of my thoughts on luck and randomness and so forth based on the ways that I was feeling and perceiving things in the moment. So
John and Brent Hanks
yeah, kind of my first
here
go
to
at
shepherd
this,
you
but
through
I think it'll be fun and
the
insightful.
last of the
Gotta get that
2026
heads up
PokerGo
record
Cup. Lucky
to
Chewy
be a little bit
has
better.
not been so lucky. Heads Up, 16 wins,
Well,
18 losses. Sam
yeah,
Soverel,
needless to say,
a little above 500, but just look
he's
at
gotten
that,
heads up a
whopping
lot more than I have, that's for
73
sure.
visits to the dance. Looks like he's taking your shot.
I'll fast forward a little
Heads Up,
here.
$160.
So
As
right off the bat, I think it's really interesting in the beginning of a match. It's kind of like, obviously we played together a lot over the years and even over the course of this final table, but, Heads Up is different. There's certainly like a dynamic shift. And I feel somewhat similarly to, the first time you see someone, even if they're an old friend, like the way in which you start off the interaction is naturally going to have some reverberant or resonant effects down the line. So I think that in terms of making the right choices for the hands you have early, there's, in some cases, at least by my estimation, a larger impact than down the line later into a match. And I just felt pretty strongly that, this being the first hand, we're 40 big blinds effective. Both of us are going to be playing 100% of hands on the button. It was nice to kind of start off with a limp here.
The cards in the air.
Obviously, raising is
30
also
and
a totally fine
60,000.
play, but
so deep.
yeah, I
here.
just liked sort of taking that passive approach, and typically
Jack off, played as a limp.
speaks to the style I
Big
like to
little
play, which is
offsuit, Brent.
a
We've
little bit
seen
more
this.
defensively. I like to wait until later
Yeah, he
streets
may
to
activate. To
be aggressive,
case.
and
Chewy's
you'll see
got him
over the
right
course
where
of
he
this
wants it.
match
The
that
power
Sam
and value of just limping a hand
doesn't
like
always
King
approach
Jack,
things quite in that same way.
understanding.
He's at times a bit more
You have the
front-loaded with his
big,
aggression.
little sorts of combos.
Again,
in
just
dire
sort of a
straits.
stylistic thing, but
This is
I limp
already
in
so lovely
and
by
happily
Lichtenberger.
call the raise, and of course, pretty good situation for me, dominating the king free.
Dominating as we head to our first
but
flop of heads up play.
he flops a pair.
9-3 deuce.
And
Soverel.
the remainder of his
slips
hand is
into
not
the
that
lead by a
interesting. He bets
And we'll be seeing
half
future
pot.
streets.
I call with the two
quickly
overs in the backdoor
coast-
flush draw,
Work,
and then we
really
just
being-
check it down. I think that,
And we got problems.
there could be a
if we're
case to be
Chewy.
made for bluffing the river with my hand. Obviously, ace high is a holding I could target. I don't know how often he would bet ace high on the flop. It's kind of one of the main issues. He very conceivably could check the turn with a 9, and then a lot of hands, certainly the one he has comes to mind, but a lot of hands could check the river when the flush completes. It's going to be easier for me to have a flush given that I've limp called a raise. I can have plenty of suited hands, and I've called the flop bet, and then taking the free card on the turn wouldn't be inconceivable with a flush draw. So I just thought all of that combined, I have a lot of straight draws with no showdown value. I have high card hands with a single heart that are less than king high, and I figured
May feel compelled
it
to
was worth just taking showdown with the king jack, and first pot goes to him.
to factory.
I thought there was a world in ace. He opened
So
up
I'll
the
just
door.
kind
If
of
Chewy,
move along here because it's
we are watching two
a nearly 80-minute
of
heads
the
up
most
match.
dynamic minds.
I mostly
in
just want to
all
kind of get
of
my thoughts
tournament
out. So
poker.
interestingly, Sam didn't know what I had, right? He checked the river and I checked back, but it's funny to see that he also, his first button is getting king jack off and limping in,
Square off.
and I'm
We're
pretty
in for
happy
a
to
treat.
check back with queen 4 suited, or check queen 4 suited.
Well, Soverel's in for
And
a twirl with king
this
jack.
is sort of the first relevant
Didn't go so well
hand
for
of the
Chewy.
match, and
It's
there's
looking
something
pretty good
interesting
for
that
him.
happened here, and I'm sort of excited to share what my
Not
thoughts
a lot
were.
on the
But
stovetop for
I checked the
Lichtenberger
flop right
beyond the
away. I mean, I mostly notice it in myself because it's easy to be very reflective of your own play, but I felt like when I checked, I did it in a subtle way that somebody as perceptive as Sam could conceivably have picked up on, that I was maybe a bit stronger than average, or that I had a hand that was willing to continue. More than likely, he did not pick up on that. But to me, this was relevant because were he to have, it kind of sets somewhat of a tone for the rest of the match if he's able to sense that type of thing. It's, again, very subtle, but, when you're playing with the best players in the world, it's not inconceivable that they pick up on these, extremely subtle things. You played thousands of hands against one another over the years. You've sat across the table for hours on end. So, it might seem like, oh, no one's giving anything away. We're all human. And in any moment, it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility that somebody could pick up on something. But we do go check, and then the turn comes to 7 of diamonds.
Just as I say it,
Here they go.
off
giving
rolls
me a
a
queen high
diamond.
flush draw, and there's a lot of hands I could bet the turn with. Straight draws. Primarily I want to bet hands for value of a 7 or better. Maybe a 5 with a draw, maybe occasionally a 5 without a draw. But mostly I want to target higher card hands with the the bluffs that I bet. And queen high, sure, it can target king and ace high, but it's kind of interesting. A jack 5 board is probably going to be a better flop for him anyway in general. So when he decides to check the flop, it's already a fascinating data point. And stemming from the way that I felt myself when I checked the flop, it was sort of a situation where I felt as if it was worth exploring in some sense how aware of that he was. And I thought that he could have checked a little bit more often than he might generally on the flop, leading to him having, potentially more hands like 8,
See what
9,
Chewy
10, 9,
decides
etc.
to
that
draw
even though I'm
up
ahead
with
of,
just the
and I
flush
could
draw.
conceivably just call. I often
Limp
like to
spot.
start out matches pretty
Flop one,
aggressive.
check. There's a world in which he
And
can find raise here.
Yeah, I just decided that
10 seconds.
it
Call
was
also seems,
it was worth
of course, fine, but he
taking a
does
chance here
lean
and putting in a pretty
raise.
big raise.
I think he
Just
would
kind
do
of
this
seeing
if he had a
how
jack,
things develop.
if he had a 7.
Again, kind of
various
leaning on this
draws.
dynamic that I'm often going for these delayed lines, waiting until later streets to really drop the hammer, keeping ranges wider and balanced on early streets. Obviously all of this is within reason, and I don't think that the best way to play is to always be entirely reliant on these dynamic aspects. But the structure of the game being what it is, I felt that this was a reasonable time to mix in this raise. And in a kind of broader sense, I think that one of the aspects of poker that I find most fascinating, and something I at least seek to articulate via the Khemset brand and the vehicle that it presents, is this idea of sort of navigating uncertainty and having higher resolution views, or a higher resolution perspective in the moment that diminishes the aspect of randomness, or the felt experience of it to some extent. So obviously here, that's not really working out for me in a direct sense, but the way in which this plays into the remainder of the match, I felt was, not a net negative per se. So I raise. Sam
I
tanks a
feel
bit,
like
he
those
calls.
diamonds,
Kind of really his only
Chewy's
play.
mixing in various.
In a spot where I'm check raising the turn and I have, a pretty polarized range, and ostensibly he shouldn't have a jack as often when he checks back the flop. He doesn't really want to 3-bet.
draws.
So,
So
Eyeing a swing.
river comes a king.
Well, here we
I
are
have
with
queen
jacks full
high.
of kings on
If
the
he
end.
had
but
a
you're
hand
not
that
ripping. I mean, you
was
don't want to fold out
6, 8, 8,
what
9,
could be a 7,
maybe a turn
right?
flush
That
draw.
Chewy has, and
It's
even if you're
conceivable
up against the
that
flush draw,
he could have
mathematically,
bet
you're
called
a
the turn.
huge
Obviously, the
favorite
4
when
of
you have
diamonds isn't
on the
great
rib
for me,
points.
but I check, expecting to check
Several
fold. And then
into
Sam just
1.2,
comes
he
out with
goes
this
370.
really tiny bet of 375. And it's so small, it's less than a third of the pot. And I know that he knows that I know that it's not really a theoretically optimal play. This can happen sometimes in these lines where players are aggressive. Like I check raise the turn, then I check the river on a blank. It's not really that likely that I have anything, because if I did have something, I wouldn't want to risk him checking back a hand like a 7. So when he bets, it's kind of like he should be pretty polar, and thus using the smaller size is sort of inefficient. That being said, in this exact case, he's sort of just, targeted the exact hand I had. And I was more curious than anything, but I also sort of like playing the dynamic where my opponent has failed to get appropriate value with a hand node like this. And yeah, I don't mind, sort of having gotten here this way, having built the pot on the turn, just flicking it in really to see what they have. And if they ever do have the hand that I beat because they think that I'm just giving up, then it's great. But it could conceivably be a spot where he only has value. And if so, calling doesn't really yield that much. But all of this combined with the way that I felt on the flop
with that size,
sort of getting a sense of how he
yeah, you see Chewy a little
navigated that. You can see here in a moment I start to kind of smile,
trying to find the bluffs, right?
I'm just sort of thinking how funny this is. It's like a goofy hand. I could just check call the turn, like would be standard, but decided to go on a bit of an adventure, and now I just kind of want to see, what happened here. What was he thinking? How did he feel about my flop check, and
what could Queen High still
what
beat?
hand does he actually have?
That's why he's calling.
So
he thinks he can beat a hand like 8-9.
And it's cool to see that, okay, he probably didn't pick up on anything, because had he would have not
potentially
flop,
available there.
Bet, given that, if he thinks
just 2 hands,
if he thinks I'm unlikely to fold and he has trips, like he probably should start putting money
from
in.
Chewy. So
Poker, not the most riveting start, losing the first 2 hands
Chewy with
and
24-2.
relinquishing the chip lead.
For WPT, we're
so I go for the open with 8-2 suited.
At both crafts, no limit and PLO.
In this case, Sam goes for the raise.
But I really think his no limit game.
I think this is just a sort of fine normal play and heads up.
Over the better part of 2 to 3 years.
I just go for the 3-bet with 8-6 off. You can fold out a lot of dominated hands like Jack-8 offsuit, Queen-6, King-6 offsuit, etc. Even just hands that are better or roughly equal in strength. It's nice to occasionally 3-bet hands like this. It's not a sort of a default play or anything, but again, sort of leaning on that desire I have to kind of understand the structure of the game and sort of get the mixed decisions correct or roughly correct. I just felt like this was a good opportunity, intuitively in the moment, to sort of, play aggressively against the open, and
especially
worked out pretty well there.
See everything stand that advantage of the unclear.
So
I don't
in, folding. We sort of have one of the more interesting situations coming up soon.
Forgot to move him.
This was an interesting hand. He opens a call with ace-4. And we just check down every street. I think it was a bit of a missed opportunity by Sam. I think the board is coordinated enough that by the river, he probably needs to bluff any hand worse than ace-high. It's not hard at all for him to have a hand with a 10 in it, whether that's a low pair plus a 10 or a Broadway hand plus a 10. He also has the king of hearts. Of course, yes, I do play very tricky trappy and could still maintain some strong hands in my range. He's not going to get the bluff through 100% of the time, but I think my hand is, or rather his hand is just a bit too weak. He probably won't win at showdown often enough. Ace-4. So that was a nice one to win.
Your next hand. Okay.
I was quite happy with this hand. I opened 9-6 suited. He defends.
Would that 7 be
I flopped this gutter. This rainbow board. It's certainly one which I could begin attacking on, and I could use some larger bets as well. Just given the fact that I've opened and he's defended, I have on average stronger 1-pair hands in my range, and it's a fairly coordinated texture. But just intuitively, something kind of felt like it was the right spot to check. As we can see, not only does he have the 7 diminishing one of my straight outs, he has my spades covered and he has top pair. So
special card if it
watching this back, I was really happy to see that
We talked about the heads up
again, in terms of
experience
getting
for
the
Sam
mixes
Soverel,
right.
39 and 34 overall record.
It's
We
a
did not
situation where
touch
had
on
I
the point
bet,
that
I
he's
could
also
have
your
cost myself a lot of
Nash
chips.
taking down.
So he just
So,
tossed the turn
not
I get out of there.
Really?
He just limps ace deuce. I check queen five
Five.
suited.
Looking up at the 8-6.
Again, another
Trying
hand
to roll
where
off free of charge.
we're just checking to the
Soverel
river.
has that ace.
I'm sort of, on the turn, feeling like I could bet, I could check. The 5 is certainly not a card that is impossible to have hit him. He doesn't have a lot of incentive to bet bottom pair on the flop. I do have some incentive to bet the turn with my 5 because he has single diamond hands like the one he has here that are going to call. I also have a lot of bluffs that I want to bet. And when he checks the flop, I do have a pretty significant advantage in straights and flushes and certainly full houses. So that's worth considering with a deep stack to pot ratio. But
Some diamonds.
I just keep checking with my queen 5, and then the river's an 8. And at this point, I felt very confident that I should check because I would check basically all of my queen high hands.
If we're chewing.
And if I bet, I probably want to
I mean,
use
a
a
double
big
pair
size
board,
exclusively.
Ace high tends to take
or at
pride,
least
especially
I
heads
should
up. I mean,
consider
it's a
using
lot
a
of
big
hand,
size
and you know
because
that Chewy's
he can have a
capable
lot
of
of
paying
hands
with something
of
like
ace or
king
king
high.
high
Look
value
at
just
this,
trying
though.
to show down.
Chewy slipped it over
He
to
could have a
Soverel,
6
who's
as well,
going to
so
value bet
there's
ace
some
high.
there's
And
not
by
the
the
need to
way,
just play
for
totally
Chewy to
barbaric
recognize
and only overbet
that
or something. But
Sovrel's pre-flop
I check it. He goes for a
limp
bet. I probably raised too big here.
cuts this self. Sovrel
I think
wouldn't
I
have looked
actually
him up.
did
But
the
now,
math wrong.
Chewy, with the
If I'm not
option
mistaken,
to check
long
raise
days.
it.
I'm not perfect, but I went for 840. He basically
is.
snap folds.
That's precisely what he's doing.
But it was cool to get that check raise in,
840 total.
and we had a fun exchange afterwards where he
What
made a
was
bit of
that?
a funny. No, go back. He made a bit of a
What
funny
was that?
noise. I kind of raised my eyebrows at him, like, "Hey, brother, I'm here."
I don't think it was our Foley
Don't think
artist.
just because I checked 3 times I don't have anything. So yeah, we're continuing to just kind of play some normal small pots where nothing too eventful is happening.
action.
Obviously, that pot with the queen 4 versus the king jack was pretty significant.
That'll
And
do
I
it.
just put in a lot of chips on the river there. Here he's value betting
Sam takes it.
middle pair or third pair or whatever,
It's
fourth pair.
Intimidate. Oh, well, it's a
Nothing
guy
too
who-
unusual.
None of that is
Okay,
bothered.
so this is really the first major turning point of the match. And I think this will be a good example for people of how I think about randomness, luck, and why, you have more agency than you think, basically. So when he limped, I kind of felt like I should ISO this hand. I was going to make it 5x, and then inexplicably, I just decided not to. And again, this is subtle, but this was just the time. It was the right hand class, or at least a reasonable hand class. I had the sense that it was the right opportunity, and I just failed to execute. And it's a subtle kind of spot, right? It doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, but such is the nature of high stakes poker against great players. It might not seem like something has that much impact, but it can actually be quite impactful. And
bring Chewy, and
as we
that's
see
where
here,
takes all off the slate.
I check.
I think
He
it's
bets.
Chewy and
Obviously, I call
Soverel
the bottom pair.
that they
he turns
are-
a 10. I check. He bets
11,000.
very small, which is fine.
Now, when you
I
square
have
off heads
the
up,
gutter.
in this particular
I'm,
moment, this is
Getting
a little
direct
bit of pride
odds.
on the line.
You
I
know,
This is
could
where things
conceivably
get
bluff some rivers.
You know what's interesting?
but-
Yeah, I'm green second pair.
Yeah,
You
I
know
just
what I mean?
call.
Yeah,
They
definitely.
actually,
Chewy.
This is maybe one of the rivers I could have bluffed. Card matching a 7 plus a flush draw. He of course can have a flush as well, so I'm not that excited about leading the river. But you can see how once I've foregone that raise pre-flop, I end up losing this small pot. But even though the momentum or what have you in poker is highly debated, some people think it doesn't matter at all. Some people think it matters a lot. The reality is I lost a pot here, and it's a swing, right? Like 600,000 chips are going his way. There's, a little under 8 million in play. So that's significant no matter how you put it. And had I ISO'd, he would have folded pre-flop and I would have won the pot. And I sort of knew because of how I felt pre-flop that I made a mistake. And I was acutely aware of that. not in like a beating myself up kind of way, but just in a, okay, I made an error, and this is what happens when you make mistakes. You typically get punished because that's just sort of how reality needs to work in order for it to function. If you make a mistake and nothing happens, then, what's to stop you from continuing to do so in the future?
Sure, Soverel's thinking
So,
DV all the money, but
this sort of begins
with
Just
poker
very-
variant,
what the
a
net
quote-unquote
result
lucky
was, but,
stretch of cards for Sam. But all the while this was happening, I sort of knew that, at least in some sense, the contributing factor was that first initial turning
if
point.
any answer,
So
what
I
point
limp
you-
in, ISOs,
guy-
I
Hey,
fold.
not a-
That's 2 in a
I don't
row
know,
for
Rex
him.
I'll
fused out there right now.
I
Is
ISO the
he
4-5
laid it on-
suited,
the
which I think
folks
is
at home,
fine.
I'll
He
let-
has a
Still
6.
with a piece.
He flops top pair, I flop bottom pair. I bet, he calls.
Trip.
Turn ace, I check. He
Yeah,
bets a
that's
third pot. I
300.
almost just folded
Yeah,
the
you're
turn,
caught
but I know that, a lot of the hands that he's going to limp call with are suited. So he can have a lot of backdoor hands that could just stab the turn. Now, granted, those hands might not just shut down on the end, but
Bad's land now.
I went
is
for the
chewy.
check call, just sort of feeling like
And you
the
may
strength of
not
the 5
fold
is a
here,
bit too
but
much to
you
let go right
certainly-
away.
We,
The river
of
came
course,
with
are
4.
in with a hand like queen. So
I check. He now goes all in for like 100 and
wow,
what is it? 2.8 into 1.7-ish. So, my math is not as sharp as it might ordinarily be. Let's call it 175% pot or something. So just a giant bet. And yeah, I have no real interest in calling this hand, especially because I typically, will find enough hands to trap with such that I don't think it makes sense to dip this far down into bluff catchers to call. But, I mentioned the dynamic earlier where he went really small for value earlier. Granted, this is a much different spot. The aggression is not as broken. It's conceivable that I could check the turn with strong hands because the ace is not that bad of a card for him. And primarily, a lot of my equity on the flop comes from having top pair when I raise against his limp and bet the flop. So, yeah, anyhow, this to me
so
is all
those
still...
non-paired.
I'll just clarify something and say that I don't think that, because I failed to ISO the king 7, all of these hands had to happen this way. But I feel very confident that had I ISO'd the king 7, there would have been a different sequence of events that would have unfolded thereafter. And it's like, okay, well, how do you know? I mean, I don't. Obviously, it's a, sort of parallel reality, a different quote unquote future timeline. But I just know from playing poker for so many years, when you do get the mixes right, just better things happen. Like, the better you play, the hotter you run. To me, it's not rocket science, I suppose, but it's not like clarified or quantified either entirely. There's some intangibles. I don't know how to prove this. And it is an interest of mine. I do have some ideas of things I think could be fun, but to bring clarity to this topic. But
Broadway.
yeah, it
Soverel goes
just seems
for it.
somewhat self-evident to me
Covers
that,
chewy. No
the better
heroism
decisions you make, the better
on
situations
Andrew's
you find
mind.
yourself in, even if they appear
And this is
to
now the
be
largest
random or not
disparity that Soverel
sort of
has
directly
enjoyed.
linked to one another.
The victor.
So I have ace queen
both-
suited
but
here.
maybe-
I raise, he defends. I don't really want to bet my hand on this flop very often. I could bet. The king
No
is obviously
action
good
on
for
the
my
9-7-6
range and not
board.
amazing for my hand.
Wow.
We go
Slides
check,
right
check.
off.
He
Just
slams the
action.
river. He just goes for a
100.
giant bet.
Chewy's not
I'm out of there.
Just is
poker.
the
Yeah, we
Ace
get another
7
hand
flush draw.
where,
Bottom
again,
pair
it's
for
kind of
Chewy,
things
deeply
going his
vulnerable
way.
here in the face of an 80K sprinkle.
I am not going to fold a pair to the bet after checking back. The turn's a king. He just pots it. I know he has a lot of single diamond bluffs. The 8 in my hand is
pot
not
from
great.
Soverel
You
and
get a lot of these situations in heads up, especially against strong players, where they're bluffing a lot. And could I stick around with the 6? I mean, the problem is, one, I still have to play the river. I'm not automatically going to get to showdown by any stretch. If he has a value hand, I'm drawing close to dead. So yeah, I mean, this is just poker kind of in a nutshell with wide ranges. You're bluff catching a lot, and your visibility is often somewhat poor in terms of being able to, get to showdown effectively. And yeah, you just have to fold a lot against aggression.
Is the best
when there's still a lot of money left to play for, even if you know your opponent's bluffing a lot. Because
Putting on a clinic.
in the case where he
Yeah,
has
he
a
is,
flush there,
Soverel.
I just end up committing an
Chewy's now
inordinate
down
amount
under
of
30
chips
bigs.
with
Plenty of depth,
exceptionally
but
weak holding. And
this is frustrating. He hasn't
you
won
just
many
kinda
pots,
can't.
that's for sure.
Can't make that work.
Sometimes
So I wanted to mention, commentators here, Brent Hanks and Ali Najad, talking about how bad I'm running, how frustrating it must be. And obviously I'm not sitting there like thinking, okay, this is riveting, I'm losing every hand. But in the back of my mind, I know that I sort of put myself in this situation. I still feel as if that first hand, that turning point with King 7, is at least part of why I'm here. So I'm not bemoaning my bad luck, thinking, okay, why is Sam getting better cards than me? Whatever. I'm looking for the next opening, the next opportunity to kind of turn things around and not to make the same mistake. I'm also getting a sense of how Sam's playing. Obviously, he is getting a run of cards here, but he's front loading a lot of his aggression. He's just generally pounding pots, like just betting huge. We're going to see a bit more of that.
there comes a point at which I begin to refer to
but I
love
think
nuts
it's just
getting loose
interesting
and people
how
getting a little steamy, the momentum and the emotion
differently
of
my
heads up
views
play
on luck
beginning to play a
and
part.
randomness
But I'm not going to
are
be doing
from
that with
seemingly the
respect to
rest of
Chewy. I've
the
already
community.
prefaced kind of that really
Yeah.
zen,
So here,
and
I
that's
limp in with
what's
Queen
going
4.
on out that kind of the
He
accepted
checks with
turning.
8-5. I flop nothing. He flops a pair. He turns 2 pair. He just, again
Again with the
pounces.
best
That's
hand.
huge. Almost 2x pot. I fold.
Here doesn't feel like he is, but
Again, totally fine
if you
play
went out
by
and asked
him.
him, he would
Probably
say
not
he's having the
exactly
time
how
of
I would
his
look to
life.
play the hand.
Despite now,
The wider the ranges heads up, the kind of way that I know that I'm playing. A lot of these plays, I mean, they can work out gloriously when he just catches me with a piece and I put in a lot of money. But it becomes challenging for him in some sense to front load so much aggression with these strong hands. And then in particular, a hand like 2-pair, he really does kind of want me to have the pairs to stick around. And ranges are wide. It's not out of the realm of possibility I have a straight. Of course, I could have a smaller 2-pair, and that would really
7
cook
in a
me,
row
but,
for Soverel.
yeah, not really
I'm just taking
criticizing
the
his
other
play,
time
just
of
kind of
his
noting
life.
the stylistic
But,
differences
he's having
in
a time.
how Sam approaches a lot of these
You know?
wide range spots versus how I approach them. I typically don't try to put as much money in
there was a time being had.
in cases like that.
I mean, this is really already
So he raises.
7 straight. Number 8 looks
I think
teed
this is
up
a good
against
play
Queen 6
by me.
off.
It's at least a fine play. He'll raise with a lot of
This is
King
one
X
of those
hand, just a lot of
dangerous
stuff in
big
general.
little type holes.
I probably could make a
I didn't
smaller
know
free
whether or not
bet,
that
but
6 would make the cut as the
yeah,
offsuit
I mean,
dangler
I just
with the
have
queen,
a weak
but Chewy
hand.
deems it to have done so.
I'm just 3
And
betting
his
against a
3
wide
bet
button
to
range,
600 is
and
just
he
going
shoves,
to take another
and I
shovel
fold.
full of it.
And it was kind of at this point that I was like,
script, buddy.
yeah, pretty funny how one hand can sort of, start this spiral. Again, do I think
Boy,
that the
it's
King
tough
7 hand meant
not
that
to hurt.
because I didn't ISO, all of these hands would not go my way? No, but insofar as being able to take agency over your decisions and improve the decisions you make, if you fail to do what you intuitively, quote unquote, know to be the right move, and then you get punished for it, the degree to which that can have an impact is, unknown. So I'm still not really feeling any kind of way. I'm just sort of accepting like, all right, well, I missed that opportunity and, hopefully I got another opportunity. And if not, then, just come back better next time. But
On his behalf.
yeah, I'm just playing the hands I'm dealt.
Now
so
he's got a fever.
here I get 5s on the button. I'm really
Pocket
happy with the way I
5s,
played this hand.
along with an
I limp
offseason
in. Sam
The
goes for the
stacks
ISO
so
at
well,
7-5
thinking that
offsuit.
Chewy can be
And
limp.
commentators thinking I'm going to limp shove. I think it's a fine play, but knowing how these spots typically play, I have a pretty wide range. I have a lot of suited hands, right? I have a lot of, okay offsuit hands, and I'm going to want to call a lot in general. Getting him to fold 2 overcards is nice, but Yeah, I mean, it is conceivable. A hand like King 8 offsuit, he could certainly, raise and fold. This spot will probably diverge a bit in practice from how it, quote unquote, is meant to play in theory. But, as you can see, him having a hand like 7-5 offsuit and me having 2
Calling
5s
more
and,
often than not.
and just calling his raise and us
fives.
going to the flop with me
That's
in
a
position is
vulnerable
pretty
hand.
nice.
It continues.
As
He's
it were,
been out
he
flop
flopped
by
the
the
7.
This is
He bet the flop. I called.
40.
Turn went check.
My
He then bet
Shit.
this kind of like
With the check,
55-ish, 60%.
he just feels like second
pop
best.
bet on the river. I really didn't feel like this was a bluff in game. I considered shoving. I just don't think that I really want to bluff that often. I probably would also prefer having a 6 in my hand to make it less likely that he has improved to some sort of wacky 2 pair. I mean, if he has 7-5, he can probably have 7-6. He can probably have, deuce 6 or 3-6 or 6-6. So having a hand like a 6 with diamonds could make sense. If I have diamonds, it's also more likely he's bluffing, because if he's bluffing, he's primarily wanting to target me having a flush draw, right? It makes sense that he would, want to fold out the hands that I have, which don't have any showdown value, first and foremost, and then focus on, maybe getting me to fold a pair or what have you. So I did just go ahead and fold.
in a row.
And I was really
Or
happy
Sam
sort of
Soverel.
watching that back, that,
That's just
it's easy to feel like, okay, your opponent's holding over you. You're just looking for that next opportunity to push the issue and like sort of, get things to be like back on your terms. And I think that's not always the most effective way to approach things in poker. In terms of, sort of going with the flow and building up a repertoire of soft skills, I think that it's generally, for me, a lot more effective to sort of take the situations as they come and to pounce when it feels like the right move, as opposed to doing it in a way that sort of might gratify the ego a bit. It's like, okay, finally I got another pot. Because if I'd shoved, he would have folded, right? And I would have won the pot, which is great. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But, just as much as you want to get the mixes right and you do want to focus on what does your opponent actually have in the moment, you do want to have a sound thought process. And, navigating uncertainty kind of requires a balance of these two things. So, I actually didn't really feel as if it was a mixed decision. I felt very confident that I should just call with the 5s. So yeah, I was actually quite happy with that hand, and I don't
what's it
feel
going
any
to take?
sort of
I mean, there's a
qualms
point at
about,
which even
letting him
someone like
have seen the
Chewy
flop
has
with
to sit there and
a
wonder,
dominated holding.
especially. And let me just take these 2 racks.
So this was interesting. He certainly could have shoved his King 3.
You just park them in
I
front of
finally
you
pick up a
and head
hand.
to the valet.
And I'm definitely going to shove the ace against the limp, the dead money. He
Bet
folds.
number ripping it. He would have walked right into
And this sort of starts to begin a bit more of my ascent back towards, having a shot in this match. So I have Jack 9, I limp the button, he's
Big
King 3
set.
suited, he checks. I flop top
9-16
pair.
board.
Wait a minute.
It's a
Chewy
relatively connected
Top
board. I
pair?
go for a half
with
pot
top
bet.
pair. Well, hang on though, because
Yeah,
He
he's not
folds,
king
which is
three.
a bit
the
tight.
fact that he
King
didn't
high in the
peel,
back door, he could
Yeah.
certainly
little
stick
bit that he
around.
really keep a thumb under his quote unquote change.
But yeah,
any
obviously
trends
this
or
feels
themes that
good.
might-
I got a couple pots. Just sort of playing a match where your opponent wins every hand is naturally not that exciting, but
This out there, if we can call it
not
that.
too
in
interesting of
limp
a
pot.
hand there. He bets after limping. I didn't want to ISO the 10-3. Nothing really to do on the flop.
Top pair versus
I like
middle.
this hand from me. I
Flop.
check back the flop with the weakest 7. I'm not too afraid of the 10, especially when he checks. It's now time to start getting value. I bet
40.
pot. I could even bet bigger.
Now
maybe
activating
I
a
should.
pot-size bet is Chewy.
He has a 5 with a king. He beats a lot of draws.
Soverel going to make the call
Seems
here. Is he
at the
going to
very
make the best
least
hand? Though?
justifiable for him to call. if
Take
not
a king or a
standard.
5.
And the river's an
Instead.
8, completing the flush, and
Eight
I
of
have no
hearts.
interest in
Pretty
betting.
wet one.
So I'm happy to take showdown, and it's
Chewy.
great to
Knuckles
see
back and you
that
see
I
Sam.
take
Familiar
pot.
experience. Registered. I
Um,
guess it would be good to say, please.
and this
fire
is
as
kind
many,
of,
150.
I'm going to give you a
The
live
major
update
turning
load up
right
the
point.
now.
He
Uzi.
limps.
I think is what they're
I have
hoping
ace
you
queen.
do right about now.
I could make a
Loaded up
smaller
is Chewy
raise.
here with ace queen.
Hold on. I felt
Ace
like
5
sort of the
suited,
dynamic of the
limped
match
it in.
was
Chewy
that
jams.
as I'm sort of getting back in,
This is for 20.
I don't want to give him the
20
opportunity
bigs.
to
You see Sam
like win a
chuckling,
small
this is
pot, and
uncomfortable.
in general, this type of hand is not going to play as well.
Is
Like if you consider, let's just say he has a hand like,
What's the range?
let's say 10-6 suited.
1,
He
5,
wants to face a
4.
4x, right? There's a lot of hands where he's a lot happier to face a small raise than he is to face a shove.
Wow.
Interestingly, ace 5 suited, if I was him, I would be pretty happy to call the jam. I am meant to, and very
Worst
conceivably
cards. I know,
could shove
there's his
hands
time
like
extensions. Yeah.
king little offsuit, just because the ranges are so wide and there's dead money. I could have a hand like 6-7 suited. There's just a lot of hands I could have that he
is
should
with ace
beat.
5 suited.
And of
We
course,
have
he
the
will sometimes
king
be
little
dominated.
jams in trouble, but
Or have
that's
one
it.
overcard
Feeling
against
it
a
like
pair,
Sean
but
Winter style, you know?
I would have every pair here. So
he called. He called.
yeah, he sticks it
And
in.
he's in
No.
bad
And
shape.
he said he was feeling kind of like Winter, had a good feeling about the
This-
hand.
Surprised you-
to 30.
Needless to say, it didn't really go his way. As we see here, I flopped queens
We-
with a nut flush draw. He's drawing down
In
on the
more
turn.
ways than one. One
And,
pickup.
just kind of
across those 10 hands.
a
Yeah, we
fun
are
little stretch
back
where
In
I really
business
do.
for Chewy,
I do think
just
back to that
like
very
that.
first hand with King 7 as such a significant part in the match. It seems so subtle, and it feels
Isn't
like
it
the type of
amazing?
thing
I mean,
where
Soverel
most players
dominated.
probably
heads up play,
would just let it be an afterthought. But
but just one hand can
you know,
change everything.
At this point in the match, I'm acutely
Chewy back
aware
to
of the
40
fact that
bigs.
I've gotten back in. I'm very grateful for that. We have significantly more competitive stacks now. And my main goal at this
And I'm
point
not
is
making
really just to
allegations
not
that Soverel somehow
not miss
lacks
out on any of those opportunities
kind of
where
a
it feels
steely
like the right
demeanor.
move. I know that if I
But
forego it against a player
Just
as
keep
strong
an
as
eye
Sam
maybe
and as
across the
aggressive as
next few
Sam,
pots
like,
if Chewy begins
it's
to string
just
a few
not going to go
together
my way. So
at what taking Ray.
I
And
go
then
for the
all of a
limp with
sudden, what
9-8.
the hell? Chewy, and certainly it looks like the
I
run
just
good is
flop a straight,
squarely
which is
in his
fun.
corner now.
I go for a check.
Soverel
This is probably
with the
not
gutter gets a free
a
pull
theoretical
at the
play,
turn,
but I do
courtesy
like
of the
making
check
these
back
types
from
of plays
Chewy.
against
This almost limped
sort of
free.
also the dynamic where I check back a lot of boards, and he was playing very large turn bets in spots where I thought maybe it was a little bit suboptimal. It's nice to have a straight when your opponent is capable of just putting in ginormous amounts of money.
Frustrating.
But I just go for
Everything
half
is
pot on the turn.
completely Spun around.
He sticks around with his gutter, and
The
then
gut-
he check folds the river.
with
I bet pot size bet.
we got our
He's out of
answer,
there with
boys.
ace high. So
Going home.
definitely fun to have
Suited banana.
gotten back in the match. I have like 40 big blinds at this point. I defend 9 deuce suited, and with the board, I check fold.
Yeah.
Is that brother has
A fun throwback to my, I guess, outward hippie days. I'm sort of still quite similar on the inside, but
Kaya?
definitely looks a lot different
I
back then.
forgot.
Was that a
about-
Zeke?
That was sort of.
Here I raise
And,
with jack
Branch
9.
Davidian?
I
Is
get
that
a
what
king
you're-
high board. I just go for a C bet. He folds.
He was cruising around in a wood-sided.
This is another interesting hand where
That's
Sam
remarkable.
raises.
Yeah.
I
You can
defend
hear
with
it
ace
coming
3.
from 10 miles
No,
away.
I
Get this
hear
king
ya.
queen
It
4
belched.
board. I think this is a fine play by him.
This-
He has a nice hand to make this play with, right? He's got 3 to a straight, a 5 high flush draw. He's really just looking to leverage the fact that because I didn't 3-bet pre, he can have conceivably a lot of stronger one pair hands than I do. But I'm not in love with this play from him. I think it would be better on an ace high board. Again, it's fine. I just typically don't like to make these types of plays as often on these textures. I feel like a small bet is just so efficient. Like, for example, I would have folded this ace high hand for a small bet. So he will make my life difficult when I have, like some weaker queen X holdings, some gutters, like, 10-9 with a club. It's a bit awkward to face the 80% pot bet. But yeah, just again, another stylistic difference between the way that Sam and I approach situations. He's just a
best.
lot more front-loaded in terms of his
Soverel
aggression than I am.
managing to.
Let me.
Iceland?
And we can see here, Sam also went through a phase with long hair. I feel like he looks like Sephiroth from Final Fantasy, or at least that's
And
what
not
it's always
since
reminded
a
me of.
glimpse through that. Did we AI cook this up? Not for real, for real.
Detoured.
I mean,
So this was
Oh,
another
I
great
do.
hand for me. It's kind of funny, early on in the match when I had 8-6 off, I 3-bet and he folded 8-5 off. In this case, he has chosen not to 3-bet 8-6 offsuit, and I have a hand that would have folded. He ends up not being in the most ideal post-flop situation. So, I don't understand exactly how these things play out, but it is fascinating to draw these parallels between the way that the cards kind of speak and the symbols of reality have some intrinsic qualities to them. So, yeah, just an enjoyable aspect of things
That was
that
early years when he first got started.
I really
That
appreciate
was
looking
very
and
long.
looking and delving into. So I flop 2 pair here.
Lot of
I
hair.
go for a quarter pot
Go.
bet. Sam goes for a
Now,
reasonably sized
look
check
at
raise.
Soverel.
Um,
He's got
I did
himself
briefly
in a
consider like
pickle.
making a small 3-bet
Check
and then like
raising
checking
the
back the
gutter
turn, which I
on
think
this
could
relatively
conceivably
dry texture,
um,
120,
get
taken
a
up
lot
to
of
half
value from a
mil.
hand like he has, because most of the time when players are check raising on these boards, they do have some interaction. And it's not likely that he folds if I make it like 950
Says,
or
I got you
whatever.
right where I want
But
you. Just call.
kind of out there. It's
Keep
not
all
really
those
my style.
bluffs
Again,
in.
keeping ranges wider, not front-loading aggression. I'm more happy to play passive
A little less
and
bluffy
sort of
maybe on the
underrepresent my
turn as
hand,
the gutter
given the
turns into an
sort of
open
average
ender.
hand strength I'll have when I call the raise. Not hard for me to have a queen, but I can also have a 4, a 7,
Is
hands
it
with
inviting
backdoors,
enough for
etc. So
Soverel to
he goes for the check
Sam
on
to
the turn, which is a
decide
bit
he
interesting.
would not be
He
well
picks up the
served
open-ender.
to bring the follow?
I probably bet a little bit
Size
too
map
small here.
in
I could probably
there.
stand
He
to bet
does
closer
have
to
to
half
protect
pot.
this type of holding.
Um,
Soverel's check raises would have had
but
plenty of equity.
yeah, I go
Obviously,
for
we can see
625.
it's an
It
open-ended
sets up
straight
around
draw,
a
but there's also the
67%,
combination of 7x of clubs, of
river
course.
shove. He calls. River's a king.
If I'm not mistaken.
Really not too scared of the flush. Jack 10
This
doesn't
is
seem very
slippery now
likely. King
for
Queen pride bets the
Soverel,
turn
or
itself. So I
excuse
felt
me,
like I
for
had the
Chewy.
relative nuts at this
Backdoor
point.
club arrival.
I also
not
have the
supposed to be
queen
a
of clubs,
This is very
which
real.
helps. So he
faded
checks, I
snap, never
shove,
calling it.
and he kind of tanks a bit. And
I have nothing.
Sam doesn't like folding, needless to say, like any great player. But yeah, I mean,
What's
can't
is
call
he
it
thinking?
high.
Well,
It's a
I
bit too
beat
ridiculous.
5-6.
I mean,
So
I made a
he folds.
Look, that's
Like-
turn this map.
And
filled.
yeah, defending Jack 10, check folding the ace high board,
More than one people.
We're going to see
opening
that.
king 10, c betting an ace high board. Nothing too crazy
one
going on.
This would
I thought you might know because you
just because
are.
the fancy.
This hand from Sam is interesting. 8-4 suited is certainly a hand that's fine to limp call, but I typically prefer aggressing with these hands. It's nice to fold out the dominated hands from your opponent. Like even a hand like 10-4 offsuit, it's just nice to get that hand to fold. So, and these small suited cards, you typically don't want to be on the defensive as much the wider the gap. Like if he had 7-8 suited, it's a lot nicer to limp because just the parts of the game tree he's going to find himself in when he has a hand with more condensed equity, which is going to lead to a lot more favorable situations for him. So
A man of
factor.
fancy.
I'm obviously happy to
Yeah.
check back with
The
my suited
boost-
jack.
Well, it's the very. Are you kidding me?
And then this is sort of a
I-
good example of how Sam and I play a bit differently. I would bet his hand on the flop sometimes, but not generally. But he bets a lot on these boards with one pair. And, again, it's completely fine play, but there's a downside of being too aggressive with weak hands, even in position on the flop. And this is something I actually see a lot of players, typically recreational players, some players I've worked with in the past. It's this desire to feel like, okay, I don't want to like show weakness, but sometimes you're just deferring the decision point to a later part of the hand where you might have a bit more equity with your range. Like there's a lot of hands Sam has in this situation. I'm not saying that Sam has this issue. He's far beyond having this type of issue in terms of his development in poker. But there's a lot of cases where certain players will raise pre-flop, for example, and they'll feel like checking is a weak play. But sometimes checking is just like a default play. It's a deference to a range that has more equity. Like let's say you're out of position, you get called by somebody in position to you. Checking doesn't mean like you're giving up on the hand. It just means that your range is not as strong as it would be against another player or on another board texture, or you have a hand in your range that doesn't have a ton of incentive to bet. So, this is just something where I think it's very worth considering, sort of understanding how flops play and what the incentives are, and how being too aggressive on the flop can lead to issues down the line. For example, if I call the flop bet, in this case, Sam doesn't really want to bet on any or many turns that don't improve him. And then he's often going to be facing these river decisions where I'm value betting some hand and bluffing a wide range because of his line of broken aggression, right? Bet flop, check, turn. So yeah, he has an 8. He blocks some draws. Maybe he'll just happily fold. But, we can see here I only have 14%. So letting a free card roll off is not really that big of a deal. And he also has a lot of hands in his range that don't really need to or don't really benefit much from betting because they have so little equity themselves. It's a pretty connected flop.
Zero
so.
appreciation. Little pink leaf.
Was or
Even
Sam, it's
Yeah.
kind of have. They could have. Yeah.
6-3. He has king jack suited. He ISOs. I fold.
Bill.
So we move past these
Okay,
ads.
of course. 40. One up. 2.
So then he has 6-3. I actually felt like this king 4 was sort of a bit like the king 7 earlier. I was like, okay, I know that this is the right spot to ISO. Just intuitively felt right. And I went for it. And yeah, I mean, again, it's a quite similar situation, right? He has some dusty hand that's going to fold to the raise. If I check, I play out of position in a smaller pot. Totally conceivable that we could have had a board where it's like 10-6-4 and I check call and I lose a small pot, right? So do we know that was going to happen? No, of course not. But
Girl's turn to limp.
I just think that this is a
6 high
great
and have a
example of
king
what
high,
happens
lean
on
on
the
it.
other end of the
I don't
spectrum when
suspect you will
you
really
do
see
make
any
the right move or
folding
what you believe to be the
pre-flop.
right move.
The price is
And,
just always so
sort of
right
understanding the structure of the
to
game
limp in, given the
and
big blind ante.
how to navigate the sort of close
But man,
decisions
we
within
have
it
seen
using your intuition to
a
just
real
guide you towards that
teeter-totter affair, just
that
back
optimal,
and forth.
in
I
the
thought
moment,
Soverel was walking away with it.
move.
Chewy with
Known
So
for
again, I get an 8 deuce
on tour.
suited. It's a bit of a tight fold from Sam here. He lets it go against my raise. He could call, he could raise. Again, I think there's a lot of incentive for me to raise hands like this because same kind of theme. The ranges are wide. There's dead money. I'm getting him to fold hands that are, dominating or stronger.
Good use of,
So
you know,
he
splash
lets it
it.
go. That's great.
blue shot.
As I was traveling.
Yeah.
He then limps.
You know,
This was
it did
Is that
a bit loose, but it's the type of play where I can sometimes feel like, okay, it's sort of the right moment to activate with this, relatively weak hand. And this sort of felt like it. Not to go full Doyle Brunson, but like, I am playing the rush a little bit. I'm less likely probably to make this type of play. Although I did 3-bet the queen 6 off when I lost like 8 hands in a row earlier. So what do I know? But
a
developed-
requirement now?
the ranges
know,
are wide.
I
I
had
think
to
all of
back
these
when.
decisions are
When
close.
you asked about
I just felt like it was a good
Yeah,
spot to
I thought you were
ISO.
talking about that.
And
'Cause,
again,
some people are
in this
saying you
case,
gotta
I
get
actually
your
got
COVID
into a
boosters or
slightly
whatever.
better
People
hand,
are still
which is
catching
great.
that stuff. The
Yeah.
other day I was watching Traders.
But I do think that that's
Right.
kind
show
of
on-
really where
on
the
Peacock.
Yeah.
If you
the
haven't
fruit
watched it, by
comes
the way,
from
it's
in a
basically
heads-up
Werewolf.
match.
I heard it's great.
against
I
a
It
haven't
is
great player.
Did
fantastic.
Boston
honestly.
Rob?
Being able to
Boston Rob was
Would
on
you
a
well
you know,
season of it.
to
Yeah.
seize aggression
well
in
known
those
as,
right
like,
moments.
top 10
And there's
players.
no
One of the players.
there's no rule book that you can use. I mean, game theory is the template that you can operate within in order to understand the structure of like what types of hands generally benefit from making these moves, what are the bet sizes and so forth. But you do kind of have to go within to feel out the nature of just sort of the context in that unique scenario to figure out which types of hands to activate with.
Leave. It's like, yeah, she had during
So again, 6-3, I limp the button,
blue shot guy.
get
Trapped
ISO'd,
it.
fold. He limps ace deuce suited,
Any
check
sampling of
7-4,
exotic
fold.
journal. Life's not keeping him sick.
Yeah,
This
no,
is kind of
no.
an interesting hand.
You
I generally wouldn't always bet these 4s on the flop. Obviously, 3 overcards kind of already speaks for itself. I end up getting
Oh,
check
yeah.
raised here.
Yes, good.
I think I could conceivably call. I felt like things were kind of going my way. And I do think that's where, again, sort of considering, because everyone's, him and I are both human. There is a sort of energetic reality to the match that is not fully captured in a purely strategic framework. But I think if I get him to fold, it's just nice, in the same way that I feel I didn't overreact and I was pleased with my decision to, not shove those 5s, for example, and just sort of wait until the situation was favorable for me. I don't know that Sam would necessarily play the same way. And the more I can sort of lean on someone in small but effective ways, I'll typically look to do that. So, yeah, I mean, this is certainly, one downside of that, where now I'm getting raised by a hand that I could have taken a free card against. And should I call and see if I can hit the 4 and, get the whole stack? I think no. I think it's just too weak. I think the visibility is too poor because sometimes I'll probably find myself wanting to bluff on certain cards. And yeah, I just think generally, this was not the right spot to put money in. It just did not feel like
Well,
it
going up
in
is
a general sense. So
Shoot this week.
I fold.
is
Sam Soverel and
He
Chewy.
ISOs. I defend Queen 8
Marching.
suited. Again, I flop this flush draw. I check. He bets very small. I felt like this was just, again, sort of the right spot to aggress. I put in that raise. Even though he only has 13%, I think it's actually quite useful to think about poker in this way where, like, let's just say I call. Are there cases where he can turn, like, a 4 of spades or a jack of spades or something and I win more money on a later street? Yeah, absolutely. But there's also a lot of cases where he gets a 4 of clubs and starts running a big bluff and I don't improve my hand, or just like an offsuit king comes on the turn and he decides to bomb it. I'm not saying that's all that likely. Like, I'm for sure a huge favorite to win the pot, but when your opponent has nothing, which again I didn't know he had, but it's just sort of worth pointing out one aspect of this. Him having Jack 5, I don't really gain that much by keeping him in the pot. If he had a hand like Jack 5 with a spade, okay, now it's a bit different because if the spade comes, he's a lot more likely to put in more money given the strength of his draw, and he'll be drawing dead. But you're just getting him to fold a hand like this that has low equity. Given that there's no card I can hit, that's going to lead to any sort of profound
Chewy looking to sift through
outcome for me, where the pot
Check
grows
raises
significantly
and
and
earns it
I
here
win
and
some
now.
large pot is pretty nice. And again, just continuing to lean on your opponent and just to be aggressive in spots where
I like mixing in some check
winning
raises with those
pots
flush draws. That's
is
one of the
great.
combinations
And
that I feel like has
you generally
really fallen
want
from grace
your opponent to feel like
as a candidate for a check raise. And different
it's
textures,
challenging for
obviously.
them to win
makes a
pots. The more
difference,
pots
but
you win, the more likely you are to do well in the match.
Real passive post-flop
Captain
approaches
Obvious
with those
statement.
T-words. He's
So
queen.
again, I'm limping trash. He ISOs, I fold.
The next or
I'm checking
some
if I do
is
some
the
fold
head
flop.
not
Now we're just sort of
Duckworth's
sparring
always
a
on
bit.
always on
These
the-
4s I go for the ISO
on the
with.
case,
Again,
I guess, if you
sort
will,
of
as
a,
far as building out the schedule.
intuitive
And
play.
he's
I
got his
know
ear
it
to
can go
the
either
street in
direction.
terms of what the
and,
players would like.
sometimes when I
Wants
get
to make sure
2 decision points in close proximity that are very similar, like I had the 4s earlier, I limped, I had the 4s a second time. Sometimes I will opt to just go for the different play the second time. No like explicit rhyme or reason other than, okay, well, I'm looking to balance my play. It's unlikely I get 4s twice in the short span. In some sense, you could say I take it as like a sign or a symbol, but I also just do rely a lot on how the situation feels, and it felt like ISOing there was going to be favorable. He hasn't 3-bet any of my opens yet, and I've been pretty aggressive on the button, so I'm kind of waiting for that to happen. Had he 3-bet there, I was going to shove. Again, like, it's just pair heads up. The hand is just incredibly strong, so
their
yeah, he can
appetite
have a better hand, but
is being satisfied.
he can have a lot of hands that raise fold with 2 overcards, and he can also have plenty of hands that I get it in against flipping,
I'm
which
expecting
might seem like it's a contradiction to the 5s earlier, but the 5s was different because I had limbs, my range was wider overall, and in this case, the pot would have been bigger, so I think there's more benefit in fold, and also 4s is objectively just a bit weaker than 5s, so
the
folding out
USPO
whatever
will
hands he
be
could have would also be nice.
massive. First of 10K start rolling.
So this was a great hand. I'm very pleased with the outcome here. He limps. I'm considering isolating. Again, I don't know how much that he was aware of this, but I did sort of lean on this slightly where
the bigger
And
buy-ins.
considering the ISO,
By the way, the price
and
goes up during the
it
US
seemed like I
Poker Open.
gave
There's
it-
a couple
again,
15Ks,
it's
and then the
completely
championship
be
is
in
a
my head. He
25.
might not be
Yeah.
either
And
here nor
perhaps,
there with it,
as we
but
see another
I
flop
did
rolling
briefly
off here,
consider
king six deuce
raising,
with a
and
couple
it's
of diamonds
conceivable
pair
he
for
could pick up
Soverel.
on it.
Well
So
in
again,
front.
he's betting the
The
flop.
fact that
Fine, he's
final
got middle
event is
pair.
a 25 as
I have a
opposed
hand
to
I'm definitely
just
not
the
going to
15
fold
here
to a min
in
bet.
the PokerGO
I
Cup
opt to go for the small
could
raise.
leave Brock.
So Sam has been pretty aggressive on the button, unsurprisingly. A lot of offsuit king holdings are probably ones he's going to raise with. And I could raise those myself, as we've seen with the king 4 and the missed opportunity with the king 7. But with the suited kings, I wouldn't raise as often because I don't want to face the limp shove. Although I could, we're deep enough that it's probably not as likely. So anyway, that's basically what I'm
Wilson in
representing
a
here. I
similar
go for the check
situation,
raise.
having
I
to
have the
do
3
more
straight and
work
3
than
flush,
just get into
and
six.
Sam calls. Turns a
Also
jack.
worth noting,
I need more equity to continue betting here. It's just simply too risky to put in another large
I
bet
believe the
where I'm
plan
representing a king
is that
or
throughout
better.
the course of the
and I
calendar
have,
year, you'll start to see
0
the
outs against a
buy-ins
king.
escalate. So
Well,
If I
also
had a gutter,
worth
I would
noting
consider it. If I had a flush
is the
draw, I'd
choice to
consider
check
it.
raise with 7,
But with his
8,
hand, I don't
1
want to.
diamond here.
And
Chewy was
because
on the hunt for backdoor
I know
equity
that,
with
I
this
would sometimes
combo,
check a king
took the 100K
because the
out of
jack
Soverel
is
sixes and made
it's
it
not
look
really
like
more.
250.
I mean, it is
Soverel
more his
called,
card
then
than
Chewy
mine
comes
because it
off the
doesn't
gas.
complete any draws, of which I
Sam,
have quite a few
happy
of.
to check back and take a river, which is the queen.
So the queen comes off. At this
I
point,
don't
I'm
know if
fairly
Chewy's done.
confident that he's going to have a one pair
Well, the 8
hand.
high is done if it goes
He
to showdown.
could
We have to
conceivably
expect.
have a low gut shot, although those hands probably
Got
would
a
bet the turn a bit more
pretty
often.
favorable run out.
Um,
And if you're able
and then
to assign
sort of,
a lot
going
of
back to some of the stuff
6x,
that happened
you can
earlier,
target those exact
a lot of his
holdings. That is
decisions
what
were
Chewy is doing.
seemingly,
This is crafty.
as mentioned, front-loading
Lichtenberger.
aggression. So I felt pretty
And it's not
confident bluffing
impossible
here.
to assign a king
It's
as played to your man, but
potentially an
unblocking diamonds
overbluff,
is Soverel.
but it's just a tough spot with the 6.
Is he really
know,
going to find this call?
It's not hard
I
to
mean,
imagine
would
that
be
your opponent
filthy.
could have a king in this line.
It's within him, Brent. We've seen this stuff.
Sort of like the broken
out of
aggression,
Sam
and
before,
almost,
and he didn't
in some sense,
end up
almost
winning
makes it
that national
doesn't
heads
really
up
make it
Open
look
championship
stronger,
without
but there's a credibility
making the
to
big
it
decisions.
because I could simply just have a king that's slowed down on the turn, looking to induce further
Is there
action,
ever a world
and I'm
in
now
which
just
he
value
thinks
betting
maybe I should
when
call, but
it looks like
go
his hand
north?
is sort
We
of
have
what
a
it is.
9
He's going to
in our
have a
hand,
6 a lot
which
in this line, or a deuce.
is relevant as far as
And even if he
9-10
has a
is
hand like, let's
concerned.
just say,
Yeah, I mean,
Jack 4
it
of
would have to be a
diamonds,
9-10 of diamonds.
now it's
one
like,
would
all right, he
think.
blocks the 4-5.
9-10 of hearts.
What a play by Chewy.
It's a bit
Now goes
awkward,
queen deuce of
so
hearts.
he's obviously going to need to call with some of these hands or bluff shove, but yeah, I was pretty pleased with that.
Really bad.
And I'm sort of additionally
Goes
pleased
to work
that
from the puck with 10-6
in this
off.
situation,
Soverel defends with the better
I
hand.
went for the
but
ISO.
irrelevant.
I felt very strongly that I should be checking this flop, even though I kind of assumed and later confirmed that it was a range
Possession.
bet. Just kind of funny how in this case, where if I bet the flop, he's going to call with the king high in the back door, and then the turn jack is going to come, and I'm not
Second
really
jack
going to want
rolls
to bet
off
with my
after it goes
10-6.
check, check swiftly.
But I did trust that feeling, and I checked back, and the jack pairs, and now I make the delay bet, and he just folds the king
Chewy.
high. So just another example of how, if you feel like you're getting unlucky, and I don't mean this to be sort of brutal, but consider the fact that maybe you're just not making the best decisions leading up to those decision points. I very firmly believe that, you have more agency. We all have more agency than we give ourselves credit for. And
With
making
the
good
delayed barrel,
decisions
get the job
will
done.
lead to better opportunities. There is some truth to that. I don't know the full extent of that truth, but I played poker for over 20 years, and I just feel very confident saying that.
But then the heavyweights of the
So here I have king
2026
queen, I
PokerGO
ISO
Cup.
against the limp.
As
I limp 10-4, he raises 10-9, I
some
fold.
Sarpin on haste.
That just
He
doesn't
limps
happen.
7-4 suited.
And
Again,
let's see if the limp
Pretty
is
happy
allowed
with
to
the way I
happen.
played this one.
Fifth.
I go for the raise with ace king suited. Obviously nice to have his spades dominated.
Does not look up at anything.
We get this
interesting,
flop.
though.
I could bet,
Spadeless
I could
board.
check. These sort of like jack high, semi-connected flush draw boards on the lower end. I mean, I guess the 6 and the deuce aren't really that connected, but I have a lot of hands that are strong but not amazing. Like here, ace king, obviously the nut no pair. No backdoor flush draw. There's a lot of hands he could have that, like let's say he has 7-4 of clubs. He's got some connectivity. He's got some gutters around the deuce and the 6. He's got pairs. He's got flush draws. He's even got hands like queen 10 offsuit with a single diamond that I don't always want to bet these boards with these types of misses. So when I do bet, I'm probably going to bet a slightly larger size.
Chewy keeps
I go for the
happy
check.
to
He
take the
checks.
free
I
swing.
turn the king.
And
To me, it's not
The
that
happiness-
likely that he has a 1 diamond hand. He could have a king. I did consider just betting because, well, I have a very strong hand and there's almost no action sequence barring some significant complication of the board texture where I'm going to let the hand go.
belongs to Chewy
So,
on this turn. Top pair,
If he has a
top
single
kicker.
diamond, I probably want to let him just
Third
keep
diamond.
betting itself.
You know, just
Or start betting itself.
studying these two and why I'm not
And I
talking
can have
about what they're
Plenty
what
of
they're doing,
hands like ace queen suited, ace 10 suited
the
that
bet
are in a
sizing
similar
and
conundrum on the flop.
the hands,
And then
but just
really
look
don't
at
want to
the
bet the turn because they have
physical body
showdown value.
language.
So I'm often one
Chewy
to
gives off nothing.
card match
and
those
he does the
combos
exact
and look
same
to
thing. The mechanisms with
induce
his
further
hand,
action
the
from my
slow
opponent by
shift
representing
shuffle,
the weaker parts of my range when I have the stronger
that
ones that are
hoodie
similar.
up over his cheek, are similar. Look
So
at
I go
his
for the river
demeanor.
check, which is great.
Yup.
He has nothing. He bets. I do think this is quite a close decision. Queen 10 is a hand that's real. 9-6 suited, maybe 9 deuce suited. But it's like, okay, I can raise all in for about a pot size raise. Could he check the turn with a king sometimes? Could he value bet the river with a 9? Could he even have a jack that was trapping the flop and then avoided betting the turn? That's now for sure going to value bet. All of this seems possible. I also just didn't think it was necessarily the type of situation where it felt all that strong. You do just sort of get a sense of people, especially in heads-up matches. Even, very strong players like Soverel that, I don't know, I just felt like my hand was probably best here. And I do need to get called by a worse hand, of course, if I'm going to shove. But
Allowing
yeah, I
speed-
just decided to go for it.
enough to answer Alan.
Obviously, he has nothing.
Guys,
He lets
having
it go.
shit.
to that pot.
And we're coming up to the end here.
Colin?
I'll just mention that I thought the shove was a bit, I don't want to call it an error in judgment, but if he just calls, kind of nice to keep me in when I have a hand he dominates. And am I going to raise fold a king or an ace at this depth? I don't think so. If I do, it's not very likely. So kind of a nice hand to quote unquote trap with, even though you're out of position. Just such a comfortable hand. You have so much going on already with the 2 suited broadways,
For an go,
or
depending on
rather, the suited Broadway
Oh.
hand. So the final hand, he went for the open raise to 225
Oh,
as I
wow.
did last hand. I shoved with ace 10
Soverel.
offsuit. He snapped also
raised
king
to
jack suited.
225. Chewy with a 3-bet, asking
Not much
for
to
all
say.
of it.
He's definitely not going to
And
fold that
Sam's
hand.
ready to go with
He
king
doesn't have
jack
to raise
of
with it
clubs.
initially, but
He's
once he
behind
does,
the ace 10 high
he's just
though.
always going to call with it.
2 pips.
And
Kings and
we run the board out.
Soverel
I tried to
needs
Khemset the
to hit
river.
us.
7 of spades.
It was
Anything
not
else?
the 7 of spades,
and it's
but
Chewy's.
fortunately it was the ace of clubs.
It's the ace
and
of
I
clubs
took down
for
the
a second.
tournament.
I thought
So-
a king on the river.
Yeah, super fun. Hopefully this is insightful and at the very least intriguing for people to get a glimpse into how I see sort of this, more subtle aspect of the game and how it's not necessarily that the past hands sort of influence the future hands, but it's more like the energy you bring to the game dictates the future situations you find yourself in. I think that can be applied to life more broadly. It's not the circumstance, it's the state of being that you have. And in that King 7 hand, where I feel there was a significant turning point, I just sort of knew what the right thing to do was, and I didn't do it. And, at that point, like anything that happens thereafter, it's really on you, right? So I think that looking for those opportunities to learn and grow from mistakes that you make, if you can be really honest with yourself, yeah, maybe it's not pleasant to acknowledge, but that's where the real fruit comes from. And that's what, sort of shaving away over time and getting better at can
Damn it,
Can
flicked
lead to
his
a lot of
card
success.
up into the slot. So aces and tens for
So yeah.
good measure.
good times.
And
Very
Soverel
grateful as always for
Always
a fun tournament
mischievous
experience. Obviously, I
and
love playing at
always
the studio.
in the hunt.
The staff
This
is
time
great.
coming up just a click short.
I'm friends with a lot of the
163,800
players,
going on
but it
with
is
him.
a
But
fun
lucky
atmosphere.
Chewy,
And
Andrew Lichtenberger.
yeah, they
Letting the
they
crew
run
know
a
it's not my first
top-notch,
rodeo. I know how it goes. I'm right here. I've got the
show
trophy,
over
and I've
there.
got over
It's
$250,000.
It's incredible, and
It earned
for someone
in this
who's,
one to add.
watched
to
PokerGO on
24
TV
million
and you
plus
consider
across
coming
his
out,
career.
I would, certainly
Solid
encourage
effort,
it.
and came back
maybe not for
from
the
what looked to
higher
be
buy-ins if
a
that's
pretty
not comfortable for you,
disastrous
but
pendulum swing
there's
into
plenty of
Soverel's
smaller
corner.
buy-ins
It
that
ain't
get
over
run over the
until
course of
it's
the year.
over, and Lichtenberger brings
And
home
needless to
his
say, I'm very
ninth
excited for the
PGT
upcoming U.S.
title.
Poker Open in April. So, with that all said, I'm going to sign off and, yeah, wish you all the best. Peace.